Welcome to the Knife Junkie podcast, your weekly dose of knife news and information about knives and knife collecting. Here's your host, Bob the Knife Junkie DeMarco.
Welcome to the Knife Junkie podcast. I'm Bob DeMarco. On this edition of the show, I'm speaking with custom knife maker Joe Watson. I had the good fortune of meeting Joe at Blade Show 2024, where I could bend his ear for a while, and I got a chance to heft a few of his beautiful, and I don't use this word lightly, iconic fighting knives. You see, Joe Watson's knives were some of the first I became aware of when I started considering fighting fixed blades for everyday carry or concealed carry. They were also some of the first knives that got me to reconsider traditionally wrapped handles, as I had dismissed the concept with the paracord wrap handle trend. His knives are as ultra refined and labored over as they are mean, lean, and nasty. So we'll talk with Joe about his career in knives and how he got here. But first, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share the show with a friend. Also, if you're interested, you can go check us out on Patreon. That way you can help support the show in another way. Quickest way to do that is to scan the QR code on the screen or go to TheKnifeJunkie.com/Patreon. Again, that's TheKnifeJunkie.com/Patreon.
Adventure Delivered, your monthly subscription for hand-picked outdoor, survival, EDC, and other cool gear from our expert team of outdoor professionals. TheKnifeJunkie.com/BattleBox.
Joe, welcome to the show, sir.
Hey, Bob. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It was great to meet you at Blade Show, especially after a few years of just kind of admiring your knives from afar. Do you go to Blade Show every year?
Typically, I have some where it's just not in the cards, where it's either I got other work stuff going on or my problem is always like making enough stuff. So, of course, you go out there, you got to hopefully get enough to at least break even. But yeah, I try to. There's definitely typically like more years I make it than not.
Yeah, and you were sandwiched between some pretty cool makers this year, and I know that they're a part of your little crew. But I want to get into you posted just the other day an incredible Chris blade. We're not going to show that right now. We're gonna save that for a minute. But that is one of my absolute favorites. You have a real a real refined touch, and a crisp blade is a very difficult thing to make. But before we get there, I want to get a little bit of background on you. Now, I know you were in the military and you've done a lot of security stuff. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I went in 17, like right out of high school, kind of better or worse, just everything going on with the war. And I was, watching the movies, reading the books, and just kind of the idea of some adventure, mischief, like the Brotherhood stuff you see in the movies. I bought into all of it and got in as soon as I could. And that was a period where knife stuff was kind of as a halt, just with the deployments and training and being gone. It's hard to have like a full-fledged knife shop you can go to on a regular basis, but I started learning how to do a lot with very little. Sometimes I'd go around with, hand tools in like a shoebox size container, or little like cheap bench grinders and 1x30 belt sanders and things like that. So that period of time, it was much more like modifying existing knives, changing up handles, reprofiling blades. And then the Kydex was a big part. I feel like I got a feel for that way faster than anything steel related, and it was sheaths and a lot of pistol holsters and mag pouches at the time, because now we're in the golden era of everything gear wise. There is so much stuff out there that if you're new to it, it's probably hard to figure out what's what. But even 15, 20 years ago, there wasn't nearly the quality and the selection of stuff out there.
So are you saying that you were making knives before 17, before you actually enlisted?
Yeah, probably like 15, 16 was when I made my first one. my mom had taken me to this Renaissance fair in Eastern Pennsylvania, and the thing was like a spectacle. And there were people all over there that were just like legit craftsmen. It wasn't like they were selling some branded Vistaprint cups and that sort of things, legit craftsmen. And I remember stopping for a while and just watching and talking to this guy doing a lot of blacksmithing, and had a blade he had been working on and was working on some other tools, and just seeing the hot metal move and the sparks fly. I thought it was awesome. And then right after that, I ended up going to a bookstore and found Wayne Goddard's $50 Knife Shop,
Have that book.
which I don't know if they've revised it. I've wondered, like with inflation now, it might be like $500 Knife Shop. I don't know, but oh boy, it teaches you a lot of the basics that I see even more experienced people skip over, important stuff. And it just shows you, if you're willing to use some elbow grease, you can get by and get started with not much.
What were some of the things in that Goddard book that you think people are skipping over these days?
One I see, I don't do a lot of it's a big thing with hidden tangs, where on a knife you never want any kind of sharp corner. And the reason for that is, as you're thermal cycling it, as you're going through heat, cold, and rapid transitions through those, it's a stress riser. So you'll get fractures in there, which hopefully you can detect along the way, but sometimes that's difficult. And also just in use, if the knife's taking shock, bends, etc., not a great thing. And you see a lot of the knives with those sharp corners on there, or on a hidden tang, you see the tang, and then it comes right up to the blade. And when they break, that's why they always break at the guard. So I have like some I do here, and it's hard to explain without pictures, but when I do mine, I mean, the tang is only coming down a slight bit from the actual width of the heel of the blade here. It is very stout right here. And it complicates like assembly, because you're running really close to the outside here. When you're shaping this, you're kind of flying blind. So it takes more time and more guard fitment, because instead of just dropping down a straight slot into the guard, you need the interior of the guard to swoop down in that curve.
Oh yeah.
But that's why, hidden tangs have a reputation for being weak and prone to breaking, but they do not have to be that way.
That's interesting. Okay, so I have a cold steel right here. Ordinarily, I wouldn't show this in an interview like this, but I have a cold steel here, and actually it's a full tang, but you can see where the shoulders are squared right up to that guard. They just slid the guard up, and so this is where you're talking. That's where you don't want those right angles, right?
Yeah, right where the tang meets the blade, or on some knives, even like a full tang, you'll see something come up to a choil. But any of those sharp corners, everything should be radius. There should never be, like a 90-degree or something really sharp geometry-wise on that, because it's definitely a stress riser.
So you got the book. You made a couple of knives, or made your first knife. Were you immediately bitten by the bug to make stuff? Are you a maker in general? Would you be doing something else, making something else, if it weren't knives?
Yeah, I don't know, for a living or not, but just building stuff and tinkering with stuff. Yeah, I mean, I'm playing with guns, doing welding, like fabricating stuff. I'm a terrible carpenter, but I like the woodworking. Just, yeah, I like using my hands and making neat stuff. Just anytime I've been around a craftsman that's just been around forever and knows this stuff, like, it is like school is in session for me, and it's a treat and pretty inspiring.
So you got what branch of the military did you go into?
I was in the Army, which was mostly just because, you walk into a recruiting office with all the branches in there, and the Army guy kind of got to me first. So. And yeah, some people have stories about the recruiter kind of screwing them, or car salesman them into something. Looking back, that's not something I can blame. My dude was incredibly honest. Like, when I told him, I was like, I want to do something like, the war stuff, like infantry or something. And he's like, all right. not going to lie to you, it effing sucks, but that's what we want to do. Here you go. And he had some good tips afterwards on stuff to, maybe do or avoid, but he shot me straight on it and, wasn't kidding.
So what was the quality of the knives when you got there? I mean, you already had this love built up for knives. You're issued some knives. What were they like?
Issued, like if you ever tried to look up NSN system, basically everything that's a production company knife is in there. I mean, there is a huge variety of, you name the big production company knives. Probably the most common I saw, like that you might get right off the bat, was the M9 bayonet, which, if you want to call that a knife, and I think several people make them. I know Ontario was one, but I believe there have been other contractors too making them. But it's, as a knife, pretty poor. The edge is extremely thick. It's made for durability and for stuff soldiers do. Like, they're going to use it as a pry bar and beat on stuff. So you got no edge retention, really thick geometry. It doesn't cut. And a lot of guys, once they got the chance to go buy something, in a lot of places in the military, that bayonet is like an accounted for sensitive item. So it's tracked by the arms room. And if you were to, lose that thing, that is like serious business and consequence. It can technically is the equivalent of like losing a rifle or some night vision or something.
Wow. Okay.
So a lot of guys were like, I don't want any more crap. I got to worry about losing, and just head down to the PX, and there, all your folding knives, fixed blades, not a whole lot. Sometimes you'd see something like a skeletonized thrower or like a hunting kind of knife with usually some big guard, kind of belly drop point blade, and usually a good old floppy nylon sheath that a lot of times has shiny silver rivets putting it together. And then, eventually when everybody was getting on the internet and stuff too, that started to open up some. But yeah, so nothing, real great. The folders, a lot of people just like now do folders for the convenience. Slip it right in my pocket. It's pretty light. But I don't know how many times I'd see guys where, we'd been out doing something and he goes to get his knife and he's like, did I give somebody my knife? And, what happened was like a tree branch or a strap on a pack, like you take your pack off and it peels it out, or a tree branch plucks it out, and you may or may not realize it if you hear it hit the ground. So that was a super common problem. And then especially getting in the places in the Middle East, just the sand is so bad there. Just everything is getting antiqued with sand that a lot of the mechanisms would get so fouled to where you're sitting there, almost struggling to try to open the blade. And then sometimes they wouldn't immediately lock into place because there's so much dirt built in there. So at that point was when I started leaning towards like, yeah, I need to find a fixed blade that's reasonably thin, not so big and wide, and, light enough that I can put it on my stuff or always have it with me. So I don't have to worry about mechanical failures anymore. And if I have gloves on or my hands are really cold, like when it comes out of the sheath, it's ready for me to use.
Yeah, intuitively that makes sense to me, that a fixed blade knife is just always kind of going to be a little bit more reliable in dire situations or in tough conditions. So tell us about how you started making the fixed blade knives, the style of fixed blade knives you do now.
Initially, then it was, guys would see the knives I had and they'd say, hey, I got this, so can you do something with it? And it was a pain, but it got my brain working on how to address some of this stuff, because I'd be working on whatever knife they handed me to see what I could do with it. So that got me looking a lot at design and thinking about that aspect. What happened towards the end and right when I was getting out, I was starting to look at, there were some issues going on, and a guy I'd worked with doing sniper stuff went over to the base on their fight team. So those guys fight and teach combatives, and they were doing studies and found out that you know, even though you got some strong, tough guys, sometimes you're doing prisoner handling or go into a room and your helmet and your vest, there are handles all over you that somebody can get a hold of. And it is really hard to get them off. You know, it's not as easy as you'd think to maybe crack them in the jaw and get them to let go. And if it was, you know, a lethal force situation where they're, you know, trying to use your weapon or kill you, they started looking more at using blades to do that. And then the flip side was everybody even now wants to just say, I'm going to get this really cool knife, strap it on, and now it's an asset. But at one point, there was a unit in the Army that did a study on all of the, you know, knife fights that were going on in the GWAT. And what they found, there were quite a few, but not always for the reasons people think. The primary ones were happening during prisoner handling.
Huh.
So you're trying to detain a guy and he sees that handle sticking out and says, and goes for it. And now they're in a fight over a knife. So I did not want something that was like, you know, 10-inch Rambo handle sticking out where the whole world can see it. So I started trying to tuck them behind places or keep them on my belt line where I can still get to them quickly, but they're at least a little hidden from view. And then back then with all your handles, stuff was like rubber, injection molded plastic, all black stuff. So it stands out like a sore thumb. And, you know, rubber and plastic, you spray paint everything, but it still doesn't hold up. So that was where I started getting into trying like tan and earth colored cords, and the earth colored G10 started coming out and that sort of thing. So it was kind of, yeah, dual purpose.
Kind of blending into the uniforms you were issued.
And some of that also came from, I went to a tracking school that was ran by a guy named David Scott Donnellan, who was like one of the original Rhodesian SAS guys. And the stuff I'd learned there was mind blowing. Like, wish I would have known about it years before, because it would have helped like the effort and the war so much. But on the camouflage side of things, he was like, if you're going to be a tracker, they were so strict on their camouflage. We're like, every piece of exposed skin has to be covered. You go through your gear all the time. Even if you have like a tan plastic buckle in use and friction, it starts to get polished and shiny. So you're going all through your kit and your equipment and like getting real used to spray paint fumes. And you got to do that every time before you go out. So that was more not from the side of, you know, guy I'm trying to detain is going to go for it, but just camouflage in general. Because he had said when they started with things like their rifles and their radios, when they would take prisoners or meet friendly people, and they knew that those folks knew they were coming, they'd start asking them questions. How do you know they were coming? He said every time they were like, oh, I just saw this piece of black moving through the bush, and it was usually their FN, FAL, or you know, a big radio antenna sticking out. So yeah, his thing was nothing, you know, black belongs in nature. And some guys want to argue that, like, well, oh, there's crows or gorillas, but the point is to look like nothing. Like, I don't want to look like a gorilla, because that raise some suspicion.
Yeah. Okay, let's take a look at some knives that will represent that sort of concept. I mean, we're talking. I said in my open, some of your knives were some of the first. I was like, oh my gosh, you know, I can carry a fixed blade every day. These can fit into a sort of low profile look, you know, especially living in suburbia or in urban landscapes where I was at the time. You don't want all that stuff showing. So let's see some of these examples here.
So real early stuff for me was almost a lot of it was kind of Japanese style like this, which was largely just because at the time with really minimal equipment, this shape is pretty easy to do. You can almost find some steel that's about the right width and then kind of put a point on there and drill a hole or two and you're off to the races. As far as the wraps, I did forget to lay out some like Nihanto, but for some reason, I just always been into them, and that's probably like the only knives I really collect. I don't know why, they speak to me.
Nihanto, you say?
Yeah, the Japanese traditional blades.
Okay.
So at one point when I was trying to figure out handle stuff, I started looking at, I have blades with several different examples, and then went and found pictures of, many others. And it's like, now what people think, like, yeah, that's a Japanese wrapper. That is not. The truth is, back then there were people who put so many different spins on things that it's more like, probably not that is not a Japanese wrap. It's just not one that you've seen yet. Like kind of like this style here that you see, everyone doing now.
Yeah.
But I started playing with it because going through the woods and G10, a lot of that can make some noise depending on what's hitting it. And I wanted something to deaden that down. And also for the guys that were getting real strict on their camouflage IR light that reflects off surfaces at night, like plastic tends to be really bad. Anything black colored tends to be horrible. It almost like a glow stick a lot of times.
Wow.
So just to get non-reflective and something that would stay that way, I started playing with the cord. And for the combative knives, it was the grip also, because you see the peaks you have running all up and down the handle. For me, it was the best mix of like, that's going to stay in my hand, but it's not so sharp that if I have it under a t-shirt, it's going to start, eating me up or wearing holes in my shirt and fraying gear and that sort of thing. So I knew back then that a lot of those cords were things like silk, and they were using rice glue, stuff like that to put it together. And from what I gathered and reading, it used to be pretty common. If you were using that thing, you might have to get it rewrapped a couple times a year. And it wasn't a big deal because there was always people around that worked on blades back then, like very big blade culture. So I started looking at stuff like the nylon cords and using fiberglass resins, because the stuff I made, it's like we have so much equipment to maintain and try to check on that I don't want to add to it. I want something that's going to last for a really long time. So, I mean, this one, and this is a thick, stout piece that I had mostly made at the time for breaking stuff, more than knife stuff. But this was, around 2005, and it's dirty, got some fraying, but it's still, serviceable for who knows how much longer. So I know they last at least that long.
I've become a real big fan of, I just call it loosely Japanese wrap, sometimes sukamaki. I think I've read that somewhere. But I love, you were showing it in cross section. Those peaks and valleys are just great. Your fingers fall in there. The fat of your palm falls in there, and you get such an amazing grip. And you don't really need much of a guard or a guard at all. Did that play into your design?
Yeah, eventually, like when I started doing more training with the combatives and the knives, and actually doing like organic medium testing and yeah, stuff with huge guards, like your hidden tangs. This one is on the shorter side, but there's larger out there. People always say like it's great because my hand's not going to go up on the blade, and that might be true, but there's so much stuff that can happen with that lip. Like with trainers, we'd see guys that would come in to do something, and like a piece of the gear or a strap or a sling gets underneath there, and as you're carrying the momentum, can strip the blade out of your hand. And then when you're inserting it in things, and not even just fighting stuff, I mean utility use too. I'd seen guys go into town on ropes to try to get through them quickly, and either a choil or the guard, and they're not paying attention, just blade goes flying. So yeah, I try to keep the guards on all my knives like pretty low profile, and not much more than I think I need.
Well, you had a knife up before. You were showing us the wrap. You left it in the sheath, and we want to see it.
I think that was this one here. This is a early reverse edge knife that was like one of the first prototypes I made when I was wanting to come out with one. And yeah, like what we're talking now is I'm figuring stuff out. I wouldn't go to sell a single blade to the public until around 2012. I feel like midway through the year. So I was working on this stuff and doing it either for favors, barter, whatever, just for coworkers and friends for a while before that. And I remembered later on when a guy finally told me, like, you could probably, start up this company and do some of these. I'm going, that's weird. So that's how little business sense I had. But when I started putting out the Japanese wraps, like that did not go well in the civilian market at all, because you had the Nihanto collectors are purists, and understandably so, because they're trying to protect what blades are left. So they looked at something like that and thought it was just an utter abomination. And it seemed like everyone else just thought it was weird. Like, why is there a katana wrap on? And then when I started doing the shows, I'd get guys come by and it seemed like pick them up and play with them, or, buy one. And then over the years, and then following the internet, now you can't throw a rock without, somebody doing this style wrap, which they get into because it's kind of one of the easier ones to figure out and get started with. So yeah, it wasn't always like it is now though, but it works. So
I find the wrap awesome because if you like to wear it in the waistband, like you were mentioning, it snugs up to the body nicely. It doesn't irritate, but it also keeps things relatively thin, and it's so grippy. But that's interesting that collectors of Japanese swords and knives found it to be, just sort of sacrilegious. Huh?
Yeah, I didn't worry about it. Just like, okay, man, like not what I'm using it for, but got it. So, and then people were saying things like about the synthetic cords and the fiberglass epoxies, like, oh, you're too cheap to use silk and all that. It's like, no, I just want it to last more than a few months when I'm using it all the time.
Yeah, I could see. You don't have your local guy you can bring it to wrap it.
Yeah, which was neat back then. That's, I think, why I like the Nihanto, because every blade was pretty much like a legit collaboration. And collaboration might be a term that's a little bastardized now, because sometimes you see big hyped up things like X and X collab, and it's like they laser engraved some dude's logo on there and that's it, But you talk about the Japanese blades where it had to go to 5 different, master craftsmen to get completed. Like, to me, that's a collab. Or like Fabergé egg, that's a collab.
All right. So 2012, you sort of decided you could start actually making a go of it and selling these knives. They were starting to live up to your, your ideas of what you would be willing to put your name on. How did that go? How did it become a business, and what were your first big knives?
Initially, just first lesson learned on pretty much crash and burn. I had a couple people I was trying to partner with that I at least thought they had a lot more vision and, business sense and that sort of thing. And then a little while into it, I was like not agreeing to some of the stuff that was going on or some of the stuff they wanted to do. I ran into some problems that personally I didn't like at all. Like, they, wanted to say, hey, we'll do full custom orders, whatever they want, we'll make it. And that might entail somebody's showing you, like, here's a drawing of this knife I came up with, can you make it? But then you learn later on, like, it's somebody else's knife that they either couldn't find or didn't want to pay for or something like that. And I don't have the time to go research every, drawing or picture that comes through and figure out, like, is that someone else's, or has this guy been dead for 100 years and no one's worried about it? So I ended up dipping out of that, getting a real job again. Most of the equipment we're using at the time was gone, so I was back to having my 1x30 sander, bench grinder, that sort of thing. And the job I had, working a lot up in the Northeast, and I wasn't getting home very often. We were doing a lot of security assessment kind of stuff. So I'd be home maybe 1 or 2 weekends a month, and I'd usually just come back, and had just moved into another place beforehand, and sitting on the garage floor Indian style on the Craftsman grinder and just knocking out whatever I could. and started picking up more on like the combatives training and like Filipino and Indonesian martial arts then, because a lot of those places we were going to, and not only like the state, city, and sometimes the actual venue, like pretty strict anti-weapons policies. So we're thinking, yeah, can't carry a gun, knife, maybe depending on what it is, but could probably explain like some tradesman tools like screwdrivers and hammers and stuff like that. So wherever we were and we were traveling, we'd just go look up who's local, teach martial arts and stuff, and go see what they did and what they had to say.
So I know you're pretty heavily influenced by, well, you've mentioned it a couple of times, the Japanese style of knives, but you also just mentioned you've done Kali and Silat or whatever Indonesian art you're talking about, and I know that they have extremely blade-rich cultures with a wide variety of blades. Can you show off the Chris you made and tell us a little bit about this?
Yes. So I should have brought out a traditional one too, but it slipped my mind. So this is that was the one from the picture the other day. And it's polished objects are so difficult. Like the one I posted, so I'm trying to show the tip profile, even like watches and stuff. If you have two different light sources, it makes everything look like off kilter and jacked up, but it's not. But yeah, I had seen like Jody Sampson's old hand ground ballet songs, and was kind of thinking like, why is nobody doing this anymore? So I'd sat down and started figuring out how am I going to grind this, and yeah, eventually it started piecing together. And some of them, I'll do the hand rub finish on because I think it's straight up, this is an art knife, like not a practical utility knife. Sure, it'll put holes and stuff and pierce things and open Amazon packages, but just to me, very much an art knife. But the hand rub finish, you could take a Scotch-Brite pad or some 4/0 steel wool and just pull it down the blade and keep it looking pretty darn decent. And then this has what I call the Zeno grind, which is where I will take the rear part of the grind very high up the blade, kind of as high as I want, and the edge itself will be really thin there. But then as we get to the point, that drops down to a shorter grind, but also the tip is thickening at the point. So this one, if I can get the angle right, the apex of the point is about the stock thickness of the blade.
Bring it over to your left a little bit. It got lost in our logo there. Yeah. And then just put your hand behind it if you don't mind.
So
yeah.
Yeah. Oh. If you want a strong point, like that'll do it for you.
So I noticed some of your other blades, like right towards the tip, the medial ridge widens out. Is that because that's what you're doing? I think maybe that's present on that Persian you're holding there.
Here's this is easier to see what I'm talking about because it's single edge.
Yeah.
Can you see the grind bevels?
Yes.
So you see it comes up very high and then it drops as you're going to the point. And the same thing also, the edge is thickening up. So, you end up extremely broad point. Because I wanted to do something that was not like a tanto grind. Sometimes you see things that have sort of these steps going up the blade, and I don't like that because when you're cutting materials that kind of want to hug the blade, it's something that can stop it when you're trying to get it out. And just for aesthetics too, and it was something I wanted to do when I was just pushing the limits of like, what can you do freehand grinding? And it was kind of inspired by like Mick Strider's Nightmare grind.
Yeah.
Because at one point, that was just what I was working on as my goal in knife making, was I want to get as good at the freehand grinding as I can. So I saw the nightmare grind, and I heard like he called it that because it was a nightmare to grind. And I started playing with it some, and then eventually got to where I think I, mostly got it figured out. I'm relatively proud of how it looks. And I went up to Mick and showed it to him. I'm like, hey man, would it be okay if I maybe sold a couple of these? And he goes, yeah, I don't care. So I said, awesome, thank you. And I handed him the knife and gave it to him as a thanks.
Oh, cool.
And then he goes, oh, screw that. And reaches in his pocket and hands me this.
Oh my God.
So, because I asked him, and if he would have said no, I just would have said, yep, got it. No problem. But because I asked him, got a cool mixed strider custom folder out of it.
Oh man, that is cool.
There's a letter and a pouch that this goes in for my son, just about that lesson. So it was something I remember early on learning from like Johnny Stout and Harvey Dean and John Horrigan. It seemed like if you were around the shop with them and they started going to talk to you about technique or setup or something, one of the first things they would say is like, you don't do stuff without people's permission. You don't copy their work. And that drew me to the knife making a lot. So I was like, this is cool. These guys have like a code of honor that they apparently live by. I thought it was awesome. I think now a lot of that's kind of gone out the window, but it's the way I still like doing things. And
what I've gathered is it's gone out the window when it comes to large companies, but it seems
big business.
It seems like between custom makers and makers like yourself, there are a lot of shared secrets, because I think the idea is like, you could show me how to do that Zeno grind and I could work at it for a long time, but I'm never making a Joe Watson knife. I might be using some of your techniques to make my knife, but Joe Watson's knives are his own.
And there was stuff as far as like freehand grinding just skill to me. A lot of the stuff that Kiku Matsuda had done for a long time, like when everybody knows, I don't have a Kiku out, but he will run like a hollow grind into a very convex front end of the blade. Stuff like that I thought definitely unique, different, and it can serve a practical purpose as long as the knife fits the bill for what you're wanting it for. But yeah, the freehand grinding to me, like that was one of the more like impressive skills to me that I have tried to get as good as I can at. And I know, eventually I'll probably get to where I'm relatively happy, and then you just start getting old, hands don't work, or cut your finger off, or who knows what. But live it up while you can.
Yeah. Well, what's your process now? Last we checked in with your process, you were doing a lot of security work in the Northeast. You'd come home, you'd sit on your floor, Indian style, with a 1x30 and hack it out. How do you do it now?
So that ended up coming to a stop because I was just not happy with not being home so much, basically, and even the job itself. I felt like I was the weak link there because a lot of people were very like tech brain oriented, and some of the stuff, not our primary job, but like a secondary role. When I go in and look at like bunches of wires and things like that, I'm just going, I have no clue what's going on here. But I'd see them talking about like, don't you love when you get to troubleshoot like this? I'm going like, no, I want to hang myself. So eventually I was talking to like some friends and peers, and by far and large, they're going, man, you got a really good thing going, because all my expenses were paid for. Like the hotels, rental cars, all the meals were, getting reimbursed. So salary was pretty much going right into the bank. Good benefits, all that. So naturally, just decided to go put in my 2 weeks and came back and thought and go work doing some shooting training. And I was thinking about knives a lot and wanted to get some of that going. So I went, had some money socked away, went and got myself like my first real grinder, set up the shop just in the garage, but had pretty much what I needed tool wise, and then started going back to, I had all kinds of drawings and wood cutouts or really crude versions of things I'd made, and just said, hey, let's start refining these. And I knew from eventually with modifying the factory blades, there were points where I was just like, some of this is helping, but at some point you're kind of just maybe trying to polish a turd a little bit, and the effort's just not worth it. So yeah, I went all in on that point, just grinding away. And then luckily had some folks that were a little bit of an internet presence. So they'd start showing off pieces they had from me, and, started selling things from there, and just interest started picking up. And it was great because since I was selling things now, I could then go buy more materials. And the more I was working, the more I was, improving on fit, finish, and my technique. So yeah, just slowly snowballed by there. Still to this day, like, haven't done paid advertising or anything like that. And if it wasn't for guys that luckily like showed off and thought highly of my stuff, I probably would have never sold anything really.
Well, who are the people that were jumping on your work?
I'm sorry?
Who are the people who you mentioned there were a couple of people with an internet presence who were showing off your work, and then other people started jumping in and buying. Are these collectors, or are these warrior types? Who were the people who kind of got your knife selling moving?
Early on, by far and large, not much on like the knife collector side, and maybe it's still that way today. Just guys, because I was still doing the holsters, and there were a couple of East Coast shooting schools that a bunch of the cadre either just got out of the military or just retired from law enforcement. So those guys were buying stuff up. We had a guy who wrote by the pen name of Dalton Fury.
Oh.
His first book was about chasing bin Laden in Afghanistan, so very much real stuff. And then after that, he was writing like fiction books that were inspired by stuff that happened, but fiction. And he had slipped knives into some of them, this Watson knife. So that was also very nice of him, helped a lot. There's guys like Daryl Bolke that had done training for a long time, and then was getting into a lot of like writing for the magazines and stuff at the time. Huge help. And then with the martial arts, it was like guys would have a blade that they would carry, and then they'd show everybody, and most of them knew like that's what we were looking for because they were training and thinking alike. And that alone kept me busy enough.
Yeah, I got to say, I'm not surprised, because it seems like you put a lot of time and energy into thinking about what makes an optimal knife, especially for fighting and for carrying. I know you mentioned a lot of utility in the military, but of course, you're thinking of things low profile, like when you were moving around prisoners and such, and that's kind of more relatable to the everyday guy walking around, because you can't be showing off your knife. You don't want someone to grab it, or pearl clutchers to call the police on you, or whatever it is. And so it seems like you learned a lot from all of those experiences that came through in these knives.
Yeah, and I wanted to just I never thought for a minute like I'm making something so I can make some money. My main concern was always just this needs to be good, and it needs to do what we need it to do. Because I did not want to put junk out there, and sometimes to my detriment. Like some of the, I guess, the more well-known models, like the Magni, Kaidan, the CT, Rotor, all the reverse edge stuff, the push daggers. I was working on those for several years before we ever sold one. I'd sit there, prototype it out, send prototypes to guys I know, like, hey, go try it out, put it through the ringer, see what you think. And then I'd sit there just on my own, testing it out, playing with it. And yeah, always almost to paralysis by analysis, but trying to vet things and make sure that, I'm not missing anything or overlooking something.
Jim is scrolling through a bunch of your knives. First of all, I want to see more in person here, but something I just saw that I don't remember seeing, a Pesh Cobbs. You did a beautiful Pesh Cobbs, looks like.
Do you have a picture?
I don't know. He just scrolled through. It's the kind that has sort of a rounded pistol grip. And if you go up from there, Jim, rounded pistol grip, sort of a reinforced tip, double edged, kind of upswept Persian-y kind of thing. I'll be there in a second. Keep going. Keep going. I think it's, yeah, that right there. If you
Oh
freeze,
yeah, the Persians.
yeah, those are out. Those are amazing.
Yeah, I have a buddy of mine that's a legit archaeologist, way into the weapons. So he has turned me on to so much stuff, and I mean, his place is like a museum, and the books and stuff he's turned me on to. When I came across some of the traditional Persian daggers, I'm going, yeah, this is awesome. So I started thinking, looking at it from a practical standpoint, some of the handles on those that are carved jade, like beautiful, but definitely more of like a ceremonial decorative thing. So I started thinking, how can I make it a full tang? And like those two were definitely kind of a mix, mostly still on the art knife side, but hey, if you wanted to go use it for something, it'll do it.
So show us a couple of the knives you have in front of you.
Here's one that talking about like the training and the sheaths early on. So with the Kydex, there were some guys like probably Bud Neely and Mike Sastre that were real early on doing good Kydex sheaths for blades. One thing I ended up doing, because back then most guys would, try to make a belt loop out of Kydex or something like that. And I knew from holsters that Kydex always had been absolutely the wrong material for belt loops. All the Kydex ones I'd seen on holsters would break left and right. And then also with the holsters, everyone would use the 060 pretty thin Kydex.
Yeah.
And it just would not hold up. Like some of the holsters at the time, the guys who were serious, they'd buy 3 or 4 at a time, and they just know like every month or two, I'm going to have to chuck it because it's going to crack or get too hot in the sun, or left it in the car and now the retention's gone. So I started stepping up to thicker stuff that was going to last longer. And then my eyelet patterns, I didn't see it done at the time, but I knew most guys that are gun guys aren't professionals. You accrue like a drawer full of pistol holsters really quickly. And the holster world was way ahead on belt attachments. There was already all kinds of stuff out there at the time. So I go, well, most of these guys got a pile full of holsters they're not using. So they have a bunch of attachments they can harvest and put on. So I did my whole spacing to where what you really need to get all the holster accessories is 1/2 inch, 1 inch, and 1.5 inches. If you have all 3 of those, you're covering most of the attachments out there. And then, yeah, thicken it up so it would last longer. And then this knife and the sheath was one where there was a group I was training with that were training some tier 1 guys, and they had bought some daggers from another maker, pretty, I'd say like mid-tech kind of company. And I was watching with the trainers where the sheaths came up pretty high, and they had some reason for it. Like they were saying, I want to be able to put it away without looking really easily and that sort of thing. But what I'd found was, they'd come out of the blade with the trainer kind of like this and start, working through their drill or doing their demo or whatever. And I pointed it out, like, do you see where your hands land in there? And they kind of blew me off about it. So I go, whatever. And then leave, and a couple weeks later I get a call, and they're like, hey, like those daggers, can you like maybe do something like that, but it's only sharpened a couple inches at the point? I'm like, I guess. Why? They're going, well, some of the guys are cutting themselves on the blades because of what I mentioned. So my approach when I did it was one, cut the sheath to where for combative blade, like once I'm seated, like that is my grip. So I don't like, you see a lot of stuff now in the tactical knives, I think it's almost like good idea fairy, like the flared pommels, there's some benefit to that, but some of them I see out there are like full, I call them candy cane pommels. And like on the Magni, I have some of that, which this to me is always been kind of on the cusp of pushing it. It's okay, but any longer it would probably be in problem zone. And a lot of people, like with the high cut sheaths, they want to index their draw off of that. So they're going, I'm going to hit that point in forward or reverse grip. And then that's how I index my draw. And then with this high cut sheath, I'm assuming that my hand is just going to fall in where it needs to go. And I've found that a lot of times that that does not pan out that way. So with the hooks, you also run into, if guys got them under t-shirts, some of those knives, I'd watch them try to do a quick draw and reverse grip, and the t-shirt ends up wound around the hook.
Oh,
So
yeah.
then they come out and they got their shirt attached to the blade. And same thing if you're wearing it externally. I'd seen guys go to drop a pack or take a rifle or something off, and the strap just, you know, pulls it over as far as it'll go because it's hung up on it. So I don't like the candy cane hooks. If I'm going to have some kind of a bump there, I want it subtle and everything rounded over, which is part for snagging and part for just comfort if it's against bare skin all the time.
Yeah.
That's people that are getting into fixed blades. Like, I get it. They're like, how am I going to carry something like that? But these guys, you know, part of getting dressed for them in the morning is strapping on a gun. So a fixed blade is not anything, you know, larger or unbearable to them. It's just something you got to spend a little bit of time on and play with it and see what's going to work for what you want. But I think it's well worth, you know, spending a little bit of time to figure out. So yeah, this was for that particular project, a prototype of what I came up for, which in this case, it was a CPM 3V, a tan PVD finish, which was when I started to learn about the problems with PVD. Like, it is not very corrosion resistant. So if you can see this closely, there's rust on it, and it kind of matches because it's like brown rust, but and that's with oil on it too. So it would rust through that. And then the actual ones I delivered had screw-on handles, because I also found that the bond of the finish to the blade is not as strong as the epoxy. So the epoxy would peel the finish off, and if you didn't have your pins peened, you know, you'd potentially lose a scale or have it shift on there. So I went to screws, and that was another problem with their daggers. They had most of them had like a rubber, I think it was maybe like a horse stall mat kind of material, and it would just sometimes like start letting go on its own, or when they put it in the sheath, the mouth of the sheath would catch it and peel it up right there. And they had told me that the supplier had told them, like, hey, just squirt some super glue under there and hold it back down. But it wasn't, you know, working well for them. And then the other glaring issue was this is a place in the Navy, so they're ocean guys too. And if you have carbon steel around the ocean, it doesn't pan out. And they had told me the supplier's stance was like, well, you guys, warriors, got to maintain his equipment. But what they don't get is like some of the op tempos these guys are doing. You come back for a mission, maybe you haven't slept in well over 24 hours. You want to do things like maybe call home or eat, but your priorities of work are get all your equipment set up to go right back out again if you need to. So it might be a while until you get to go eat or work out. So I figure no more maintenance, you know, anything we can do that is something you don't got to worry about. That's a huge win in my book.
Yeah, especially like they don't want to be polishing their knives. They want to be making sure their rifles are ready to go, and then, like you said, go get something to eat. Two things I've noticed. First of all, that knife, that dagger, has a tapered tang. I'm interested about that. And also, just to get back to the candy cane pommel for a second, it seems like you remedy some of that with flaring it out sideways. And what do I mean by that? I mean, if you take the knife and turn it this way, it seems like it flares out on the side a little bit, which offers that grip without having a hook to snag on stuff.
Yeah, and I don't always do that, but it's definitely an option if it fits the bill, because yeah, then you also have some width there.
Yeah.
And some people also like that if you were to get the blade really stuck in something and need to pull it out, that gives you a little extra stop so you can lever it out. And this may come at an expense for some people. Like if you're trying to concealed carry it under a t-shirt, you got to work on your placement and tucking it in a little better, else you're going to have little knobs sticking out. But yeah, it's an option and one of the things that can be done.
That knife you're holding is another example of your ethnographic sort of influence. That's a Scian Du, a Scottish knife.
Yep.
Can you hold that up for us to look at?
Yep. And I've done a couple different ones. One has more of an pretty much symmetrical handle mirrored on both sides. This one I just called the round back mod, where it's rounded over. And this was mostly before, because something I always liked too was just being able to feel easily like which way is the edge facing. And for me, you know, asymmetrical handle helps out with that a lot.
Yeah.
And when you are doing utility cutting, I think having some good palm support back there helps. That was another thing why I didn't like the folders. Like, I love when folder guys talk ergonomics. I think it's like gun guys talking about trigger reset. Like, it's only something you really notice when you're on the couch. But a folder, to me, in a lot of ways, if you're doing serious like bushcraft stuff or out in the cold working with that thing in your hand for a while, it's almost like the antithesis of ergonomics, because you usually have gaps in the blade that, if they're not super well dehorned, are going to start making blisters and hot spots. You have a piece of metal clip sticking out of the side of the thing, which is usually going to be against your palm. Same thing, blisters. And you know, when you are working a lot of utility stuff or it's cold, you kind of want, folders are usually thin because they want them to be nice in the pocket, but you know, I usually want a handle for serious utility work that's pretty wide and going to like support the palm. So you probably know up there, when it gets cold out, your hands cramp way easier, and everything in your hands just tends to hurt more faster. So I find having something like this just supports it better. And it's more comfortable if I'm seriously sitting there working on wood or carving or splitting things, feather sticks, all that. Even I see it in the wintertime sometimes now, like skinning animals, where if I got a really thin knife that I'm trying to hold like several times throughout it, I'm just like, because my hand's starting to cramp up, and it's probably some starting to discover age too. But yeah, so me, custom knives, you know, is not so much about I picked this color and that handle material. It's my designs, I think, have always been more concepts, like living, breathing, than just a product. So you could look up like a Magni or something and probably go find on the internet over 100 variations, because it's things that are set up for different tasks or to excel for different purposes better, sometimes just personal taste, aesthetics. But to me, having the ability to do the options to make it excel at different tasks is like, that's what makes custom knives cool to me.
All right, so Joe, we're getting to the end of our time, and before we wrap, I would love you to hold up that Chris again.
Yeah.
And just let me take a good look at this beauty. I'm a sucker for a Chris, but I also love knives that you can carry every day that have that sort of historical and ethnic influence. I even like how you did the wrap on that handle. It looks a little more primitive than, say, oh yeah, that's beautiful. Then say some of the Japanese, more Japanese wrap, where you can see the ray skin and all that.
There are wraps. If we ever get on again, I'll bring some ancient blades out. But some of these wraps, I discovered, I was trying to figure out how they did some of the wraps, because there's really fine cords, probably like 1/16th of a diameter. But to me, on some of them, it looks like there's like 6 to 8 of them that they're working with at a time. And then eventually I learned that what they would do is they'd take all those cords and a piece of thread and gently sew them all together before they even wrap the blade. So you're talking spending hours sewing multiple strands of cords together. So yeah, it's pretty interesting.
That's amazing. All right, well, so tell people how they can keep up with you, how they can acquire a knife from you, and all that kind of stuff people want to know.
Yeah, website is watsonKnives.com. I have an email list on there. I work with a few dealers throughout the year from time to time. Then try to do a couple shows. Usually it's the blade shows right now, especially like Texas and Atlanta. I'm looking at trying to get to Utah. And then outside of that, I also understand, some of the level of work I'm trying to do and what it costs is not totally feasible for folks. So we're also starting to plan and explore getting some stuff out there that are a little more affordable and obtainable. So hopefully, I get a lot of lower enlisted cops or just folks don't want to or can't shell out the money for a custom. And I'd also like stuff to be a little more available because I understand that having to track stuff down, but also I don't feel terribly bad because some of my Japanese blades, it's like I hunted for them. There's some I'm still looking for, and I don't know if I'll ever find them because the guy's been dead for 300 years, So It's not that bad, but yeah, we do want to try to get more out there, and I'm working on some form of scaling. So yeah.
Awesome, man. Well, we'll look forward to it, and we'll keep in touch. And when you have that effort lined up, we'll let everyone know, because
I appreciate that.
Your work is awesome, and I know that a lot of people who follow this show have similar tastes to mine. And I know that you'll get a lot of reaction, a lot of interest. Joe Watson, thank you so much for joining me on the Knife Junkie podcast, sir. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Likewise. I appreciate you having me on. Good talking with you, Bob.
All right, man. Take care. There he goes, ladies and gentlemen, Joe Watson. Go check him out if you go to any of the Blade shows, especially Texas and Atlanta in June. Stop by, say hi to him, and pick up one of his knives. It will transform you, as did the Chris I picked up. It had some sort of ivory handle. Don't remember exactly, but man alive, was it gorgeous. Just as that black-handled one was that he was just showing off. And also, it's really cool to see that Zeno grind up close. It's pretty amazing. All right, for Jim working his magic behind the switcher, I'm Bob DeMarco saying until next time, don't take dull for an answer.
Thanks for listening to the Knife Junkie podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review at reviewthepodcast.com. For show notes for today's episode, additional resources, and to listen to past episodes, visit our website, TheKnifeJunkie.com. You can also watch our latest videos on YouTube at TheKnifeJunkie.com/YouTube. Check out some great knife photos on TheKnifeJunkie.com/Instagram, and join our Facebook group at TheKnifeJunkie.com/Facebook. And if you have a question or comment, email them to bob@TheKnifeJunkie.com or call our 24/7 listener line at 724-466-4487, and you may hear your comment or question answered on an upcoming episode of the Knife Junkie podcast.